You think you understand how the universe works. You wake up every morning, time moves forward, gravity keeps your feet on the ground, and the laws of physics hum quietly in the background like a machine that has never once failed. That is the comfortable story you have been told since childhood, and the declassified files released in May 2026 have just torn that story apart at the seams. This is not a conversation about little green men or cheap conspiracy theories. The person bringing you this analysis is a mathematician and a physicist, and what the data inside these 7 details reveals is not science fiction. It is a monumental fracture in our understanding of space-time itself. And the paradox sitting at the heart of these new documents is as brilliant as it is disturbing. We built military radar systems and thermal cameras using the strict laws of thermodynamics and Einstein's theory of relativity. We trust those instruments completely because we constructed them on the most rigorously tested physics our civilization has ever produced. But those same instruments built on our physics have now recorded objects that mathematically violate that very same physics. They register instantaneous accelerations that should disintegrate any known atomic structure. They documented transitions between air and water that generated zero friction, zero despite thermodynamics, making that outcome an absolute impossibility. Here is the problem that no comfortable explanation can dissolve. If the physics underlying our sensors is correct, then what those sensors recorded is impossible. But if what they recorded is real, then our current understanding of physics is barely a shadow of the actual truth. Those are the only 2 options the logic allows. There is no third door. Today we are going to dissect all 7 of these details with the precision of a logical scalpel. We will use inertial mass, entropy, and the geometry of space-time to understand exactly what we are looking at. Start with the most fundamental concept in all of classical physics, one so basic it is taught to children, yet so absolute that every machine, building, and vehicle humanity has ever constructed depends on it entirely. Imagine sitting in a parked car when the driver floors the accelerator. Your back slams into the seat. Your brain interprets this as a force pushing you backward, but what is actually happening is that your own mass is resisting the change in motion. That resistance is inertia. It is Newton's first law operating exactly as it always has. Every body remains at rest or in uniform motion unless acted upon by an external force. That single rule governs everything humanity has ever built. And it is precisely what the first detail in these declassified files destroys completely. The data shows objects detected at 80,000 feet of altitude descending to sea level in under 1 second and then simply stopping hovering motionlessly above the ocean with no deceleration arc, no progressive braking, no transition phase whatsoever. They went from hypersonic velocity to absolute zero in a fraction of a second. The physics of that maneuver are not ambiguous. To stop that abruptly in that time frame, an object would experience hundreds, possibly thousands of g-forces. Standard gravity is 1 g. The most elite combat pilots on the planet, wearing specialized pressure suits, can endure 9 g before blood abandons their brain and consciousness fails. At 100 g, the human body ruptures. At 1000 g, any biological material becomes liquid. Even our most advanced structural alloys deform and fracture at those accelerations. Steel bends. Titanium shatters. Any atomic structure built by human engineering disintegrates under its own compressed mass. And yet multiple synchronized military radar systems recorded a solid, intact, perfectly stable object immediately after executing that maneuver. The second detail waiting in these files makes that impossibility even darker, and it starts with the sound that was never there. When any mass moves through atmosphere faster than the speed of sound, it violently displaces the air molecules in its path. Those molecules cannot move aside quickly enough, so they compress and collide, generating a massive shock wave. This is not an engineering complication that clever design can avoid. It is an inevitable consequence of thermodynamics and fluid mechanics. The resulting sonic boom can shatter glass kilometers away and leaves a substantial thermal signature from the friction generated by forcing a solid object through compressed air at extreme velocity. Every supersonic aircraft ever built produces this signature without exception. In the acoustic and thermal records from the sensors monitoring these objects, there is absolute silence. The objects move at thousands of kilometers per hour, and the air surrounding them does not heat up. There is no friction signature. There is no shock wave. It is as though the objects are not interacting with the atmosphere at all, as though the air is simply not registering their presence. The standard institutional response to data like this is to blame the instruments. Software error, sensor malfunction, calibration failure. But these signatures were captured simultaneously by radar systems, infrared sensors, and direct visual confirmation. The mathematical probability of three completely independent systems producing identical hallucinated data at the identical moment is not small. It is absurd. The data is not wrong. The framework used to explain it is. The only logically coherent conclusion, one that genuinely satisfies both anomalies at once, is that these objects are not traveling through space in the traditional sense. They are not pushing against air molecules because they are not moving through the air the way conventional objects do. Instead, they appear to be moving the fabric of space-time itself. Picture standing on a carpet and wanting to cross a room. You can walk, fighting friction and expending energy with every step. Or you can stand perfectly still and have someone pull the carpet beneath you, carrying the space you occupy toward the destination. If these objects are generating a localized bubble where the space-time metric around them is isolated from the surrounding environment, then inside that bubble there is no acceleration, no g-force, and no atmospheric interaction whatsoever. Newton's laws and Einstein's equations are not being broken. They are being manipulated from a level of physics that we have only begun to sketch on theoretical chalkboards. But just as that geometric explanation begins to feel like a satisfying answer, the third detail in these files arrives to shatter that fragile understanding entirely. It forces us to examine the boundary where air meets water, and that is where the logic suffers a genuine short circuit. Consider jumping from a 10-meter diving board and hitting the water with your stomach flat. The impact is brutal, and the reason is straightforward physics. Water is, for all practical purposes of classical mechanics, an incompressible fluid. Its molecules are packed closely enough that you cannot compress them, you must displace them. Displacing that mass takes time and dissipates an enormous amount of energy. Jump from a 100-meter bridge, and striking the water surface is physically indistinguishable from hitting a concrete sidewalk. Surface tension and fluid incompressibility will break every bone in your body. The conservation of energy is absolute and implacable. The kinetic energy of a massive object moving at high speed must go somewhere upon impact. It converts into a shock wave, a violent displacement of water, heat from friction, and a deafening acoustic signature. Satellite data and sensors from naval combat groups track these objects descending from low atmosphere toward the ocean at speeds exceeding 3,000 kilometers per hour without decelerating at all. No aerodynamic impact preparation, no transition. They strike the ocean surface at lethal velocity. According to every thermodynamic and hydrodynamic equation that governs fluid behavior, that impact should have produced a colossal water explosion visible for kilometers. The object should have been crushed against the ocean's density or violently rebounded in fragments. Instead, infrared and optical sensors recorded something that has been causing military physicists to lose sleep ever since. There was no splash. There was no thermal disturbance at the surface. Not a ripple. The object crossed the boundary between air and water as though the ocean were a holographic projection rather than a physical substance with mass, density, and resistance. For a researcher who has spent a career working with the exact mathematics that govern matter, this is not a curiosity. It is a direct confrontation with the foundations of physical law. Refusing magical explanations requires following the logic wherever it leads, regardless of how uncomfortable the destination becomes. The only rigorous answer to how an object penetrates an incompressible fluid at 3,000 kilometers per hour without transferring kinetic energy to the surrounding medium is this. The object does not exist in the same state of physical interaction as the water. Returning to the space-time metric geometry established by the previous anomalies, the geometric bubble surrounding these objects is not merely isolating them from inertia. It appears to be altering the electromagnetic repulsion between atoms at the object's boundary. The object is not physically pushing water molecules aside. The space itself around the vessel is flowing through matter, temporarily separating the molecular bonds of the water without creating friction, then allowing those bonds to reconnect once the vessel has passed. The ocean does not register the crossing because the crossing does not happen inside the ocean's physical reference frame. If that conclusion challenges your comfort with physical reality, the fourth detail found in sonar records will push it further. Once submerged, these objects travel at hundreds of knots underwater. Our most advanced nuclear submarines operate under a strict speed ceiling not because their reactors lack power, but because of an insurmountable physical barrier called cavitation. When a propeller rotates too rapidly underwater, it creates zones of such low pressure that water boils at room temperature, generating vapor bubbles. When those bubbles collapse milliseconds later, they produce violent shock waves that destroy propeller metal and create acoustic signatures detectable from vast distances, eliminating any possibility of stealth. This is the hard physical wall that limits every underwater vessel our civilization has ever built. Sonar operators documented in these files that the objects move at hypervelocity speeds underwater in total acoustic silence. Zero cavitation. zero hydrodynamic wake. The technology being observed treats the different states of matter, gas, liquid, solid as though the distinctions between them are completely irrelevant engineering details rather than fundamental physical boundaries. The natural frontiers that define and constrain our entire technological world simply do not apply to these objects in any measurable way. Standing before that reality honestly means acknowledging something that most conventional scientists prefer to avoid by looking away and pretending the data does not say what it clearly says. Every physical process in the universe pays what thermodynamics calls the second law tax. Entropy always increases. Moving a muscle generates heat. Running a car engine heats the metal. Splitting a uranium atom in a nuclear reactor generates heat so massive that millions of liters of cooling water are required to prevent the entire system from melting through the Earth's crust. There are no exceptions to this rule, none. Not a single one recorded in the entire history of experimental physics. Mechanical work requires energy, and energy consumption always produces thermal radiation. This brings us directly to the fifth detail in these May files, the one that is genuinely hardest to reconcile with everything our instruments tell us about how the physical world operates. We have already established logically that these objects are manipulating space-time geometry to eliminate inertia, eliminate atmospheric friction at hypersonic velocities, and pass through ocean water without transferring kinetic energy. But here is the mathematical consequence that makes this framework even more difficult to absorb. According to general relativity, curving spacetime requires an amount of energy that borders on the absurd. To isolate a vessel inside a bubble where space flows around it perfectly, the energy density required would be equivalent to converting the entire mass of Jupiter into pure energy. Einstein's equation makes this concrete energy equals mass multiplied by the speed of light squared. A tiny amount of mass contains a titanic quantity of latent energy. An object generating the energy output necessary to bend gravity on demand should appear in thermal imaging as a miniature star. It should vaporize surrounding air through radiated heat alone. It should leave a blazing thermal wake that temporarily blinds every satellite in orbit above it. The advanced infrared targeting sensor profiles used by combat pilots during these encounters show something that contradicts that expectation completely. The objects register as thermally cold. Not merely cool, substantially colder than the surrounding air and water. There is no exhaust signature, no cooling fins, no superheated gas dispersing into the atmosphere, no heat signature of any kind in multiple records. The surface of the object reads as a thermodynamic black hole absorbing thermal context without emitting any. A propulsion system with 100% thermal efficiency does not exist in our three-dimensional universe. Perfect efficiency means perpetual motion. It means a system that defies the natural flow of entropy and the inevitable degradation of energy over time. The mathematics of thermodynamics makes this outcome categorically impossible unless the energy and its waste products are not operating within our observable dimensional framework at all. Two explanations survive this analysis with logical integrity. The first is that these objects are not generating their propulsion energy on board. They are extracting it directly from the quantum vacuum, drawing on the fluctuating energy of empty space itself the way one draws water from an inexhaustible well. Quantum field theory confirms that so-called empty space is not actually empty. It teems with virtual particle activity and baseline energy fluctuations. Harnessing that reservoir would produce propulsion with no onboard fuel and no thermal exhaust. The second explanation is more structurally disturbing. These objects may be expelling their waste heat into an additional spatial dimension, a geometric domain that our three-dimensional sensors are fundamentally incapable of detecting or measuring. They are not violating thermodynamics. They are redirecting its consequences into a layer of reality that our instruments cannot see. Both explanations point toward the same underlying conclusion, and that conclusion connects directly to the sixth detail, the one about shape, aerodynamics, and the impossible way these objects orient themselves in flight. Because what our pilots and radar operators observed about the physical form of these objects dismantles every principle of fluid mechanics our aerospace engineers have ever worked with. Every aircraft humanity has ever built reflects a single governing principle. Form follows function. Wings, control surfaces, stabilizing fins, engine exhaust nozzles. Every external feature exists because moving a solid object through dense atmosphere at high speed demands constant aerodynamic management. A blunt, smooth surface cannot fly at supersonic speeds at sea level without generating a wall of drag pressure so immense it stops the object instantly or tears it apart. This is not a design preference. It is a rigid consequence of fluid mechanics that every aerospace engineer accepts as an absolute boundary condition. The sixth detail in these declassified documents describes objects that have no wings, no stabilizing fins, no visible joints, seams, rivets, or control surfaces of any kind. Their surfaces are perfectly smooth. Their shapes are rounded cylinders like enormous capsules, or in some cases, perfect reflective spheres. Flying a smooth sphere at 10 times the speed of sound at sea level is aerodynamic suicide by every calculation our engineering discipline has ever produced. The drag coefficient alone would generate a pressure barrier that halts or destroys the object immediately. But the aerodynamic impossibility deepens further when the flight behavior itself is analyzed. These cylinders travel at thousands of kilometers per hour in one direction, while simultaneously rotating on their own central axis, without any effect on their flight trajectory. They fly sideways. They fly inverted. Their physical orientation has absolutely no relationship to the direction of their movement. If a missile in flight suddenly rotated 90 degrees to travel broadside through the air, atmospheric resistance would destroy it instantly. These objects rotate freely along any axis, while their trajectory continues unchanged because their orientation in our space does not determine their motion through it. This is the mathematical confirmation of the geometric framework that every previous anomaly has been building toward. These objects are not flying through the air. They are enclosed within a vacuum geometric bubble that moves independently of atmospheric interaction. But now a deeper layer of this reality demands examination, one that requires briefly stepping outside three-dimensional thinking entirely. Imagine a universe that is completely flat, like an infinite sheet of paper. The beings living in that world know only two dimensions: forward, backward, left, and right. They have no concept of up or down. If you as a three-dimensional being push a solid sphere through their flat world, what would they observe? They cannot see your sphere in 3 dimensions because their perception only operates along the surface of the paper. They would watch a tiny point appear from nowhere. That point would grow into a circle, expand to the sphere's maximum diameter, then shrink and vanish completely when you finish passing through. To them, it would appear miraculous, an object that materialized, changed size, morphed, and disappeared without explanation. This is precisely what our radar systems and human eyes are observing in our skies. We are the flat world beings. Our observable universe operates in 3 spatial dimensions, but our most rigorous mathematics, string theory, M-theory, higher dimensional geometry demand the existence of additional dimensions beyond those 3. What our instruments are detecting is not the complete object. We are seeing the 3-dimensional shadow of a higher dimensional structure passing through our slice of the universe. That is why these objects have no seams, no engines, and no control surfaces. That is why recordings show them distorting, shrinking, and rotating in ways that violate our spatial comprehension. When the cylinder rotates without altering its trajectory, it is not rotating within our space. It is rotating along an axis that exists in a dimension our biology was never designed to perceive. Time is the most persistent and comforting illusion humanity has ever collectively accepted. You look at a clock, watch the seconds advance, and your biological brain convinces you that time is a river flowing steadily from past to future. That experience feels self-evident. But as a mathematical physicist, working with the geometric reality of the universe, rather than the sensory shortcuts of evolved neurology, the picture is fundamentally different. Einstein demonstrated over a century ago that time is not absolute. It is a malleable physical dimension, inseparably woven into the fabric of space itself. And this brings us directly to the 7th and most unsettling detail hidden inside these May 2026 military files, the detail that dismantles our most sacred assumption about cause and effect. Telemetry records from the most advanced naval combat systems on the planet documented something that paralyzed intelligence analysts when they first reviewed the data. When combat pilots executed interception maneuvers against these objects, the objects did not react to the movement of the incoming aircraft. They responded before it happened. LiDAR data and computerized targeting systems confirm irrefutably that the cylinders repositioned themselves to the exact future interception coordinate several seconds before the human pilot had even moved the control stick to initiate the maneuver. This is not a description of a faster computer running better predictive algorithms. This is a causal impossibility. The objects were moving toward the precise coordinate of a future event before the event had been initiated in the present. The conventional framework of cause preceding effect, the most foundational assumption underlying every physical law ever written, was operationally violated in recorded, verified telemetry data. Resolving this without resorting to lazy science fiction requires following the physics established across every previous anomaly to its logical conclusion. These objects generate a geometric bubble that curves space-time around them, severely enough to eliminate inertia, friction, and fluid resistance. The mathematical price of manipulating gravity at that scale is mandatory and absolute, severe temporal distortion. Gravity and time are the same mathematical entity expressed differently. Approach the event horizon of a black hole and time slows toward a complete stop relative to the rest of the universe. If these objects are locally controlling gravity, isolating their space-time metric from the surrounding environment, they are obligatorily bending their own temporal reference frame, constructing what general relativity calls closed time-like curves. Reality, under this framework, is not a sequence of events unfolding one after another. It is more accurately described as an enormous solid block. Every moment of humanity's past, your exact present, and the entire future of the universe already exist simultaneously, frozen and carved into that immense block across a fourth dimension. We, due to our neurological limitations, are forced to advance millimeter by millimeter through a narrow tunnel bored inside that ice, experiencing one instant at a time, unable to move backward or jump forward. But whoever is operating these objects, by moving through the higher dimensions already established in the previous analysis, is not trapped inside that tunnel. From outside our three-dimensional slice, they can view the entire block simultaneously. Your past and your future are not concepts of memory or prediction to them. They are physical coordinates as real and navigable as the left and right walls of a room. When the human pilot attempted to intercept the vessel, he was not outmatched by superior speed. He was outmaneuvered because the object simply moved along the temporal axis to the space-time coordinate where physics dictated his aircraft would inevitably arrive. From the object's reference frame, the pilot's decision had already occurred. That is the precise, unadorned truth that collides with human ego like a wall. What these 7 details, taken together, reveal is not merely an encounter with unknown technology. They reveal contact with entities that have solved the problem our civilization's greatest minds have never cracked: the unification of general relativity and quantum mechanics. Every observation fits under a single framework. Macroscopic structures operating in a state of absolute quantum coherence, maintained at ambient temperature through the manipulation of additional spatial dimensions, using the geometry of space-time and quantum probability as their basic operating medium. They are not engineers who bend metal more skillfully than we do. They are architects of physical reality itself,